This is a true story. Out of respect for the dead, the rest has been told exactly as it occurred. In my line of work, you get used to evil wearing the most mundane masks. It doesn't hide in dark alleys or snarl from behind bars. It sits at the next desk in the office, smiles at you at the office party, lives in a perfect house with a manicured lawn and 2 cars in the garage. It looks like success, like stability, like someone many would like to be. Detective Sullivan called me late in the evening on August 28th. I was sorting through paperwork for yet another fraud case, and his voice, usually even and tired, sounded tense over the phone, like a taut string. "Sir, you better come over. Framingham. I'll send you the address. This is something special." "How special, Jim?" I asked, putting down my pen. There was a pause. I could hear the crackle of radios and muffled voices in the background. Her face. It's almost gone. And that's not the worst of it, sir. The backyard. You need to see it for yourself. When I pulled up, the street was awash with blue and red lights. A model suburban home. The kind you see in home improvement magazines. White siding, neatly trimmed bushes, a children's swing in the yard. A picture-perfect picture, torn apart by yellow police tape. Sullivan met me at the door. His face, usually ruddy, was ashen. "Get ready," he said curtly. Inside, the house was immaculate, no signs of a struggle. In the living room, a cup of half-finished tea sat on the coffee table. Family photos hung on the wall, a smiling couple, their wedding, the birth of their son, then their daughter. All the milestones of a happy life on display. I walked into the second-floor bedroom. The smell hit me first, thick, metallic, nauseating. She lay on the floor next to the bed. What was left of her? I saw much, but this was desecration. He had used a stone, heavy, sharp-edged. It lay nearby, brown with blood. He had struck her in the face again and again with a fury that erases not just life, but the very essence of humanity. One eye was completely destroyed, reduced to a bloody mess. But Sullivan was right. This was not the worst of it. We walked out into the backyard. The night air was cool, smelling of freshly cut grass and damp earth. On the perfectly level lawn, a few meters from the children's swings, stood what looked like a primitive altar. A crudely sharpened stake was driven to the ground, and on it, impaled on it, were her internal organs. Liver, heart, lungs, torn from her open body and displayed like grisly trophies. This was not just murder. This was a ritual, a savage primal act that screamed something more than mere rage. He hadn't just killed her. He had dismembered her soul. "We found him," Sullivan said quietly, looking away from the spectacle. "He didn't run. He didn't hide." My gaze froze. "Where?" "Driving around town, just aimlessly driving in circles." The patrol stopped him for speeding. I felt a chill run down my spine, something completely different from the cool night air. I already knew what my next question would be, and I dreaded the answer. "Was he alone?" Sullivan shook his head slowly. "No, sir. In the back seat, in a baby seat. Their 4-month-old daughter was sleeping peacefully. A little girl driving around the city at night with her father, while her mother's battered body lay in their perfect home. He hadn't even seen fit to take the child to safety. He'd just taken her with him, as if it were the most natural thing to do after turning your wife into a bloody art installation in your backyard." "Did he say anything?" I asked, trying to collect my thoughts. "Confess? Explain?" Sullivan looked at me. There was a mixture of disgust and utter bewilderment in his eyes. "You know what he said when we pulled him over? Not a word about his wife. Not an ounce of remorse. He was calm, totally calm, like he'd just come back from the grocery store. The detective paused, choosing his words. He looked at us with empty eyes and said just one sentence. Mission accomplished. Threat neutralized. I froze. Threat? What threat could possibly be lurking in this perfect home, in this young mother? And what the hell did his mission even mean? In that moment, I knew this case would be like no other. This wasn't just a domestic dispute that had spiraled out of control. It was a descent into madness, and my job was to prove that this madness had a cold, calculating, and completely sane mind. To Richard H. Rosenthal. When I first saw his profile, I saw a resume, not a man. Director of Acquisitions at John Hancock. An annual income of $96,000, and this was in 1995. A house in an upscale suburb. A wife who worked at the same company. A young daughter. On paper, Rosenthal embodied the American dream. He was a man whose decisions were worth millions. A man trusted with complex calculations and strategic planning. A man with a clear, sharp mind. Remember this. This is important. It didn't start with screams and police sirens. It started with whispers in the hallways of our office. A woman, his wife's colleague, came to see me. She sat across from my desk, her slender fingers clasped, her gaze darting from the case files to the window as if searching for an escape route. I don't know if I should talk about this, she began, her voice barely audible. It was a long time ago, about 5 years ago. I waited silently, letting the silence do its work. She came to work, with a black eye, a huge purple one. When asked what happened, she lowered her head and said she'd walked into a closet door. I nodded. A classic example. The door. Always that ill-fated door that appears out of nowhere and hits you right in the eye. And him? I asked. Richard. What did he say? He was there. He put his arm around her shoulders, and with such a caring smile, he confirmed, "My poor thing, so clumsy." But his eyes, Mr. Attorney, there wasn't a drop of sympathy in them, only cold, irritated coldness. She said that history repeated itself a couple of years later. Another bruise, another door. Co-workers whispered. But what could they do? He was the big boss, and she was his quiet, frightened shadow. No one wanted to interfere in someone else's family, in this perfect house with a perfect facade. This testimony was gold. The defense would scream that this was old news, irrelevant. They would insist it was an attempt to smear their client's character. But I knew these weren't just bruises. This was prologue. Each of these violent outbursts was a stepping stone, leading down to that dark night of August 28th. We had to prove to the court that this wasn't a sudden onset of madness. This was an escalation, a slow, methodical, years-long siege on one man's soul. And then the report of that night's events landed on my desk. I read it and felt the air in the office grow thick and cold. The words on the paper were dry, formal, but behind them lay such an irrational terror that my own mind refused to accept it. The detective who was first on the scene called me late that night. His voice, usually calm and cynical, was trembling. "You have to see it to believe it," he said, "although it would be better if you didn't." He told me about the body in the backyard, about the rock lying nearby, heavy and brown with blood, about how the woman's face was. It wasn't there. It was a pulp. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the ritual. Rosenthal hadn't just killed her. He'd cut her open. He'd removed her internal organs, her heart, liver, lungs, and like some primal priest, impaled them on a sharpened stake, which he planted in the middle of their manicured lawn. And after that, After that, he'd taken their 4-month-old daughter from her crib, placed her in a baby car seat in the back of his car, and simply driven off aimlessly through the night streets, dead-eyed, until a patrolman pulled him over. A sleeping baby in the back seat and his wife's blood under his fingernails. When I first met his lawyer, he'd looked at me with an expression of professional sympathy and laid his trump card on the table. "My client," he said carefully, "does not deny that he committed these acts, but he cannot be held criminally responsible for them. At the time, Mr. Rosenthal was completely insane." I waited. I knew what would happen next. In cases like these, there is always a next. He acted in a state of acute psychosis. He was firmly convinced that his wife was no longer human. He believed her to be a hostile alien vampire, part of a global conspiracy to take over Earth. By killing her, he was saving humanity. Alien vampire. A 6-figure acquisitions executive who had masterfully negotiated multi-million-dollar deals until his dying day suddenly decided his wife was an alien. The theory was so absurd, so offensive in its mendacity that for a moment I was speechless. The defense was going to turn the courtroom into a circus, to stage a spectacle of madness, to hide the cold, calculating cruelty behind it. And I realized this trial wouldn't be about what Richard Rosenthal did. We all knew that. This would be a battle over why he did it. A battle for his mind. And I had to prove to 12 jurors that behind the mask of a madman lurked not a monster from outer space, but a common earthly tyrant whose hatred had been growing for years. That night, I sat in my office with 2 photographs in front of me. One had been taken 5 years earlier by a co-worker of the victim. In it, she was smiling sheepishly, a disfiguring bruise spreading beneath her left eye. The other was from the forensics report. It showed what was left of her face after the murder. I looked at them, and an icy realization began to take shape. A connection. An ominous, ugly connection. The same eye. In 1990, a bruise from a blow. In 1995, a completely shattered socket. This wasn't the chaotic act of a madman battling a vampire. This was deliberate destruction. He wasn't trying to exorcise the alien. All these years, he simply wanted to extinguish the light in her eyes, and that night, he followed through. On paper, everything looked perfect, like an advertising brochure about the American dream come true. But beneath the glossy cover of this life lurked a rotting black abyss. And my job was to tear that cover off in front of the jury. The defense built its strategy on a single but deafening thesis: insanity. They brought psychiatrists into the courtroom who, wringing their hands, spoke of profound psychosis. They painted a picture of a man broken by grief after the death of his first son. A man lost touch with reality. The climax of their theatrical performance was Rosenthal's own statement. He spoke calmly, almost matter-of-factly, that his wife was not human. She was an enemy alien vampire, the vanguard of an invasion, and he was only protecting his daughter and the entire world. There was silence in the courtroom. I saw some of the jurors shudder. It was so outrageous, so far-fetched, that it might have seemed true. Madness sometimes looks just like that, absurd and frighteningly logical in its own frame of reference. But I knew it was a lie, cold, calculated calculation. When my turn came, I didn't shout. I spoke quietly. I picked up his resume. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I began, looking around at them. "Before you is the director of acquisitions for one of the largest insurance companies in the country. A man whose annual income in '95 was $96,000. His job is analysis, strategy, risk assessment. His job is a cold, clear mind. This man, right up until the day of the murder, was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. He convinced boards of directors he calculated profits for years to come. Do you really believe that a mind capable of such complex operations would suddenly shut down the moment he stepped into his own home and see his wife as an alien vampire? I paused, letting the words sink in. The defense wants you to believe he suffered a sudden attack of insanity. But we've presented you with evidence that proves otherwise. We've presented witnesses, colleagues who saw her, Richard Rosenthal's wife, with a black eye, not once but twice, long before the tragedy. And what did this brilliant analyst, this loving husband, tell them? He used the same memorized phrase. She ran into the door. Twice, 3 years apart. He lied then, and he's lying now. I stepped closer to the jury box. Let's talk about cruelty. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a madman. Remember the testimony of my colleagues, the black eye. Now remember the medical examiner's report. The rock strike was so hard it shattered her eye socket. This is not an accident. This is escalation. This is the targeted destruction of the same place he had already marked with his cruelty for years. He didn't just kill, he erased her face, her identity. And now I get to the most terrible part, to what happened next. A madman unaware of what he was doing? But what did he do next? He didn't scream in horror, didn't call the police. No, he performed a ritual. Methodically, expertly, he cut her open. He removed her organs, and he impaled them on a stake in the backyard. This is not madness. This is triumph. This is the grotesque trophy of a victor who has finally completely subdued, dismembered, and put his victim on display. And after that, he took their 4-month-old daughter, put her in his car, and drove around town. It was completely calm, as if I'd just taken out the trash. I returned to my desk. The silence in the room was almost palpable. Richard Rosenthal is not crazy. He is a monster who wore the mask of a successful man for years. He controlled her spending, controlled the temperature in the house, and controlled her life, and finally, with the utmost cruelty, controlled her death. His story about vampires is not the ravings of a madman. It is the last, most brazen lie of his life, a lie calculated to deceive you. The jury did not deliberate long. When they returned, their faces were unwavering. I looked at Rosenthal. He was calm, his face an impenetrable mask. No fear, no remorse, only cold anticipation. The voice of the jury foreman rang out in the silence of the room like the rap of a gavel. On the charge of murder in the first degree committed with particular cruelty or savagery, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. There was no sigh of relief, only the hard realization that justice had been done, but it could not bring back life. The sentence, life without parole, was just a period in this story written in blood. His appeals were later rejected. The system worked. I kept the Rosenthal file for a long time. Sometimes I would open it and look at the photographs. Not the ones with the mutilated body, but the ones with her smiling. A photo from her office several years before all of this. Her eyes did not yet contain the fear that I later learned to see on the faces of the victims. I thought of the little girl who would grow up never knowing her mother and knowing of her father only that he was a monster. That stake in the backyard. It became a phantom image that haunted my nightmares for a long time. This case left a deep scar on me. I thought I had seen the very bottom of human nature. But it was not the end. It was just one circle of hell among many that I would go through. Justice never sleeps, and neither does evil. I'd barely closed the Rosenthal file and filed it away when the phone on my desk rang. Then the secretary placed a new, still thin file in front of me. A new name. A new tragedy, a new facade to be torn down. But that was just one chapter in the endless book of human darkness, and the next one was already opening on my desk.